Everyone. Thank you and welcome to the session. My name's Sharon Mortimer and it's a great honour to be co-moderating this Alpha session supported by I3 with my colleague and good friend Dean Morbeck. Alpha is Alpha Scientists in Reproductive Medicine, the International Society for Clinical Embryologists that was founded in 1994 by a group of scientists who recognised the need to establish a professional status for clinical embryology, as well as international laboratory and practice standards. Just as a quick introduction, because our bios are on the website, on the I3 website, I beg your pardon, Dean is the Chief Scientific Officer of Kindbody Inc. and an Honorary Associate Professor in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at Monash University, and I'm sure we're all familiar with his papers on quality in the laboratory.
Oh, well, thank you, Sharon. And in turn, I'd like to introduce you as the President of Alpha, again, this sponsor of this session and one where we are focusing on an area that we all find very useful and important in KPIs. Before we start, I'd like to remember that you ask your questions using the Q&A section of the conference service and not the chat function. So we're seeing you all say hi in the chat, but use the Q&A to ask your questions. So our first speaker is Sharon Mortimer. I think she does not also need an introduction because most of us have a copy of the Mortimer books. So as everyone should know, it's Sharon and David, but Sharon has done an amazing amount of work in our field. And she will provide a quick overview of Alpha Scientists in Reproductive Medicine, from where the society started through to what we're working on for the future and where today's session fits into that. All right, Sharon.
Okay.
Share
thank
screen.
You. Screen and try and go to the beginning to share the screen. Here I am. Oops, sorry. Here I am. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dean. And I'd like to thank I3 for the opportunity to speak with you today. As you may be aware, we were hoping to speak with you in person last week, but unfortunately we had to postpone our conference until October in 2022, and that was obviously because of the pandemic restrictions. I'd like to especially welcome all the Alpha members today. Thank you for joining us. And for everybody else, what is Alpha? So, you know, what is it? What's it all about? I'm going to give you a little quick overview and then talk to you about what's going to happen next. So the beginning, Alpha was founded in 1994 by pioneers in the field of embryology, clinical embryology, IVF. Professor Bob Edwards was the honorary president. And the aim of Alpha was to further human reproductive medicine in all aspects, bring together embryologists from all fields to promote international understanding, cooperation and collaboration. So the idea is that it's a mix of sharing knowledge and practical experience, all in the aim of improving the way that we practice and improving our understanding of basic reproductive biology. One of the ways that we managed to do that originally in the days before the digital age, before we were able to talk around the world like this, was through newsletters. And I went back through the archive and discovered that our first newsletter editor was Giles Palmer, who's obviously with us today. Those newsletters were published from 95 to 2008, and they kept us in touch with all sorts of things. So advances in reproductive biology, there were original articles, news and views on current topics, conference announcements, reports, new products and technologies. Lots of different ways to be able to keep up. And the other thing that I thought was just lovely, because we refer to ourselves as the Alpha family, and in these newsletters there were classifieds. And again, going back through the archive, I got to see when lots of embryologist babies were born. So that was wonderful. Other innovations that Alpha's done is putting together skills-based workshops and symposia, and we still do all of those things. A great breakthrough in the 1990s was the internet conferences that were managed by Kay Elder and Thomas Elliott. And the thing that was amazing about those was it was all managed by bulletin boards, and The conference was started. It was open for 24 hours. So everybody who wanted to join from around the world had the opportunity to read what everyone else was talking about, to contribute, and to have some discussions. So as we got more sophisticated, there were sort of breakout rooms for chats as well. And some of those were published. And these are some of the ones from my library, but there are plenty. And they're a wonderful resource for how things were and how we thought things were going to be. The other thing was that, as part of the knowledge and sharing aspect, the educational part of Alpha, Alpha was involved in a lot of the original master's programs. Now, when we think about Alpha, the first thing I ever hear when I talk to anybody about Alpha is conferences. The conferences are like literally legendary, and they're great because it's wall-to-wall embryology. It's a great place for embryologists to meet, to learn, and to socialize. All of the sessions are in the same hall or in the same room, so everybody gets to hear the same information and gets to get updates about all of the new research that's happening in reproductive biology, some translational research, how we take the discoveries and put them to practice in the lab, and updates on technology, because we have a wonderful trade show as well. So that's the great thing about the Alpha conferences. And like I said, hopefully we'll all be able to experience the next one in October 2022, when we're all allowed to get together again in Seville. The other thing that people know about Alpha are the consensus meetings. While the conferences show us where we're going as a practice, what the consensus meetings have done have shown us where we are. And their idea is to help us to practice in the best way that we can. So we're getting our knowledge and updating on technology from the conferences, but what the consensuses do is help us to work towards a way of improving our practice. It's there for the practitioners. It's for a way of us getting an idea of what is best practice. And so we've got the Istanbul Consensus on Embryo Assessment that was conducted by Alpha and by the ESHRE Special Interest Group Embryology, as was the Vienna Consensus. There was also a consensus meeting on cryopreservation KPIs and on the professional status of the clinical embryologist. So what was the point of all of those meetings? Well, the Istanbul Consensus is a touchstone for reporting on fertilization and embryo development. So before the Istanbul Consensus, if someone said that an embryo was good, we couldn't automatically know that when we pictured it in our mind, it was the same as in the other person's. When someone said an embryo was a grade 4, did that mean it was great, or it wasn't, morphologically, it was not one of the better ones? So what the Istanbul Consensus did was gave us a way that we could all talk together to make our descriptions of embryo morphology accessible to us all. The cryo consensus was great because it gave us metrics in moving from slow freezing to vitrification. So we could make sure that we were still performing at the expected international levels. The professional status consensus was in 2014 in Antalya in Turkey. And it gave us, it was a very wide ranging one, and it was all about the practitioner. So the need for KPIs for competency evaluation, standardizing education and skills. What do we need to know and what do we have to be able to do to be thought of as a clinical embryologist? Defining roles and responsibilities and the need for CPD. So all of these things came out of that consensus and led us directly to the Vienna Consensus, which was the first international consensus on laboratory KPIs, which is obviously going to be an important part of today's presentations. We also found that there was a need for international agreements on education, on skills, roles, and responsibilities. And so to that end, we have started to have conversations with other international societies, ESHRE, ASRM, and ASPIRE, to discuss frameworks about required knowledge, skill sets from beginner to advanced, position, titles, roles, and responsibilities. So again, this is Alpha working with others, which is the idea, to collaborate. to try and make sure that we're doing the best we can for the practitioners, so that every day when you're working, when you're practicing, you've got access to everything that you need and the best information. So where to next? Well, obviously the conferences are going to continue. We could still have more consensus meetings. There's many, many things that we still need to have in our practice to support practitioners. We're looking at developing an educational program for members to access, perhaps to assist while studying for registration exams. An introduction to ART program. So looking at what's involved in ART, giving a pipeline to high school students or university students who've heard about this and just want to know some more about it. So in that way, we're making a pipeline. Well, we hope to be making a pipeline for the new practitioners in the field. Something that's very close to my heart is looking beyond the bench to the person behind the bench. So looking at how Alpha can help the practitioner in developing their practice. So, you know, through leadership, through stress management, through ideas about balancing work and life, all of those things. And where else next? Wherever you can see a need or an opportunity to improve the profession of clinical embryology, please let us know. We want to know, we want to be able to keep working for it. And that's what your membership does. So that's how we're able to keep working towards improving not only our knowledge and being able to look forward, but also our day-to-day practice. So you can visit the website to learn more and let us know if you'd like to become involved. Please contact the Secretary of Alpha, Yasmin Dervisoglu. And I will leave you now and say thank you very much. And I've hoped you've enjoyed the photographs of my morning walks. Thank you.
So we're going to move on to the next section, which will be my talk. And I will just share the screen here.
So I'd like to, while you're doing that, I'd like to introduce our second presenter, Dr. Dean Morbeck, who's going to speak about the KPIs we're currently using and whether they're enough to give us a picture of what's happening in the lab or whether we need some others.
Great. Thank you, Sharon. And I'd like to start with a few questions for you that I'd like to poll the audience to see where everyone stands on two different topics. One is just on dashboards in general and control chart tracking. So if I could get the first list of questions up before I begin the talk. Here we go. So there's two questions on this panel. If you could go ahead and read through those and answer them. And while you're doing that, I will start by thanking Sharon Mortimer, not just for that presentation, but for actually the immense amount of work and expertise that she has contributed to the pulling together of those consensus documents. She's really a wizard with the ability to get everyone together in a room and to get something as helpful and important to our field as these consensus documents. So Sharon's a driving force behind those. So thank you, Sharon. I'll just comment also that I'm on the executive committee for Alpha, which is why I'm co-chairing this with Sharon. And now I think, let's see, that's probably enough time. Let's go ahead and switch to a third question. Hopefully people have answered those. Put up question number 3. And while that's coming up, you do see that in the background for me. This is Manhattan. This is from a bike trip on the weekend. I am no longer in New Zealand or Malaysia. I want to say hello to all of my friends and colleagues who happen to be maybe watching this or will watch it in the future since it's early in the morning there, that I miss you all already, but that, we will cross paths soon. And if we just answer question number 3, should be pretty straightforward. Be nice if I could see a little scroll of how many people are answering it before I move on. And let's see. Okay, I think we'll go forward on that. So if we can close that poll and moving on. So laboratory KPIs are relatively new, as Sharon just showed. And really, it's been a European landmark, if you will, with Istanbul and Budapest and Antalya and then Vienna. And 2012 with the cryopreservation KPI, which is really the first one, really, here we've got a little thumbnail picture of a lot of the attendees. And then as of 2017, the Vienna Consensus, which was a collaborative effort with the ESHRE Special Interest Group of Embryology. These are really critical documents for us that we really have lacked, up until these last 5 to 8 years, to be able to use as a tool to measure how we're doing. I happened to just come across this one yesterday that there's a, let's see, not seeing, does he? Okay, hold on. You can hear me, but you can't see. So for some reason, there. I'll watch for comments, but I'm going to move on to laboratory KPIs. So I already talked about this now. Sorry about that. Technically challenging. It's a new setup here in my little unfurnished apartment room. So again, my apologies. I want to go back one because there is this new document that I just saw come out, in that there are clinical KPIs, and this expands a bit on what we already have in the Vienna Consensus. It has a few more things around retrievals and transfers. I think it's useful. I think it's something we should all be using and looking at as well. But KPIs serve 2 key purposes. They obviously can do many things, but there's 2 that I think are most important. One is around benchmarking, and that's really the standard for why we have KPIs. And that's to say, are we doing well? Are we comparing against the international standard? We want to know that we're good, and that it should, and that we're also able to compare within our clinic so that each staff member can know that they're doing well as well against each other. And that means that when we have a star performer, somebody that's doing really well in the lab, we then can benchmark against that. So these KPIs allow us to do that as well, and internationally. The second reason that I've really focused on is something that's helpful to have KPIs for, and that is statistical process control, where we watch how the metric performs over time. We look at the normal variation that we expect, which is a nice normal distribution, and then we see 2 or 3 standard deviation outside the mean to see if there's any reason for alarm. Now, we don't need a KPI specifically for this, but we definitely need to be able to track certain key variables, and these are already metrics that have been identified, so it's helpful. So now, if I could get the next answers to the first 2 questions. So the first one I want to see, does your clinic use control charts or an electronic dashboard for tracking KPIs? And nicely, almost half of the clinics use control charts, and 11% use electronic dashboards, which is great because we will be talking about them later. And then a combination of control charts and electronic dashboards, and about a quarter don't use any, which is actually a little bit higher than what I expected overall. That's great that we're actually starting to see these really put into place. And then the question is, do you believe control chart tracking is necessary and or useful? And only one person or a couple of people said no, that is not useful really at all. We just need a snapshot, which is something we used to do. We would just say, what's our average FERT rate or our pregnancy rate for last quarter, without looking at it over time. But here saying, yes, we believe variation in KPIs can help us identify problems, though we haven't actually seen this in our clinic. And this is something that we're gonna know happens. We're gonna see a lot of false positives with variation in KPIs, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking. And then there's this last group, which they've actually found something and correct problems. That's great. All right, so let me move now to the fact that benchmarking and SPC often use different KPIs. So there's a global view of benchmarking where we have certain topics, certain metrics that they're universal. Fertilization rate is universal. You should get the same fertilization rate or be able to target the same fertilization rate anywhere in the world. There's other things that aren't universal, and they may be more lab specific. And so here's the lab at Mayo Clinic. And so thanks for that from my days back then. And here's the centralized map with New Zealand in the center and my Malaysian colleagues over here. Okay, so we could use more KPIs. And here's a few examples that I'll go over. One is sperm recovery rate. Now, this one, again, is really useful to do when someone's in training, but it might not be the most useful across clinics around the world because of the different methods people use for sperm isolation, whether we're doing now microfluidics or a gradient for either IVF or for IUI preps. So that one's really not something that you would expect a global recovery rate metric KPI, but it would be something you'd want to track in your lab, and maybe particularly at time of training. Empty zona rate, in contrast, is something that's global in that we all have to do denuding if we're doing ICSI, and we all have a rate of empty zonas that we get when we're doing denuding. Now, is this something that we should be tracking frequently or all the time, like ICSI rate? I would say probably not. I would say both, like the sperm recovery rate, the empty zona rate is something we would do during training. And then if we saw that we had an incidence of increased problems with, say, ICSI or FERT rate from number of eggs retrieved, or we just thought we were seeing more empty zonas, we might want to track that again. The last one I have on here that I think we could use, but I don't believe it's global, is mosaicism rate. Mosaicism is a function of things that we don't fully understand, and we could debate all day about what it is, but we do know that it's based in part on the platform being used and the way the genetics lab is calling mosaicism. So for us to actually be able to track that is quite unlikely to do that across the globe with one standard. So instead, we'd have our own standards, maybe around a given platform. And I have seen some mosaicism rates vary from clinic to clinic on the same platform in my clinics in New Zealand, suggesting that it is something that would be user dependent and important to track. Okay, so now let's move on to some KPIs that I see that could use some refinement. And I'll start with ICSI versus IVF fertilization rate. So here's the standard way we would look at ICSI and fertilization rates. And you see ICSI per oocyte injected. This is the way the Vienna consensus has it reported, and IVF per oocyte collected. And you can see it ranged from 80 down to 70s, and it came back up into the mid 70s for ICSI. And then here's the rates for IVF, which are running around 70 as well. So really not too much different. But I do believe, and this is a way we should be using ICSI FERT rate when we're comparing clinic or staff to staff, and even clinic to clinic, that we want to be able to say, how proficient are you at doing ICSI? It's not a good way to compare ICSI versus IVF, though, because it's not comparing apples to apples. Here's ICSI per oocyte collected. This gray line shows you once you put the same denominator as IVF, you see that it drops quite a bit. And if we just then remove the ICSI per egg injected, you can see that there's a difference, and that this difference is important. And in fact, you can see here, it's very small, such that if we're at 75 to 80% ICSI rate, then we're probably no different than our IVF FERT rate. And so that's just an important piece of information to understand, that we don't compare IVF and ICSI based on ICSI egg injected, particularly when the clinicians are looking at higher FERT rates on the per injected basis than per collected. Okay, that was my ICSI IVF soapbox. Next, let's talk about usable blastocyst rate. This is something that's not well described in the Vienna consensus, and it's a good reason, because we have different criteria for using blastocysts around the globe. So it isn't something that we can necessarily say this is the standard for the entire IVF industry, but it is at least something that should be discussed and obviously made standard within a clinic. Now, I'll just throw up a few images of blastocysts that I think most of us, hopefully all of us, agree we wouldn't freeze these. These are just 3 different sections of different blastocysts. And it is something that, I don't think having blastocyst rate alone helps anything. So seeing something like this, we're going to call it a blastocyst. It's got a blastocele cavity. Of course, I don't know for sure how we define that, but I think because we allow a blastocele cavity to be called a blastocyst, that blastocyst rate by itself isn't very helpful. The next one here is, which cycles do we use to calculate blastocyst use rate? And it turns out that depending on how much day 3 or day 2 versus day 5 transfers or freeze-alls you do, you're going to see different values here. So the blue line here is how we calculated blastocyst use rate in New Zealand and Malaysia, where we only included cycles that were blastocyst culture intended. And that would include those that didn't have any blastocysts. So there'd be zeros in there. Whereas this upper line is this orange one is where if you have day 3s, now every one of those, for the most part, is going to get a transfer. So it's at least going to be 33%. I'm sorry, it's at least going to have 1 out of 2 or 3, depends on how many embryos you have in culture, but it does have a greater than 0 number for most cycles and tends to trend higher. So if you do a lot more cleavage stage transfers, you'll see a bigger gap between this. So it's important to consider that, and it's not something that was really addressed in the Vienna consensus about how we calculate blastocyst use rate. Okay, the last one I'll go over is age versus blastocyst development. And again, this isn't something that was identified. We know age is important for pregnancy rate, and the papers have already been published to show that blastocyst development varies by age. But let me just show you some data from New Zealand. And this graph is really complicated to look at, but it's got the SART ages here, and it just shows you can see the trend that with each color it goes down. I'm going to just make it a little easier and take out the middle 2 groups and show you that on average, our day 5 use rate for the over 40 crowd was 30%. And for the less than 35, as of 2019, was averaging about 45%. So we're sitting at about a 15% difference. And if I put those other 2 back on, you see there's about a 5% increment going up for each one of the age groups. So depending on your population of patients, you may see numbers that don't hit the benchmarks that the Vienna consensus says you should be hitting, and it could be age-based. Similarly, if you see a variation when you're doing control chart tracking and you're not taking into account age, you may not realize that the difference, the change, is due to a shift in the ages. So let me just show you an example of this. Here's day 5 blastocyst use rate, and this is all ages. Now this is from a pivot chart in Excel, and it has this splicer or this filter unit on here where I can click on less than 38 or greater than equal to 38. This was a number that we used in New Zealand, and I've actually found quite useful to get large groups of data, because when you get brackets of 35 to 37 to 38 to 40, you don't have enough data to really be able to assess things. So we were able to do this here. I'll show you, and then I can't do it live, but this is just the greater than 38-year-olds. And you see that while here it was nice and even at the top graph and stayed within the warning limits, although May had a drop just below the warning limit, you see for the older patients, it dropped below that further, and it seemed to stay down there for 3 months in a row. So let's just look at this a little bit different. And the point here, when I say a little bit of refinement, is that the age is effect on blastocyst development rate, for sure day 5 rate, is pronounced. And it's much different than the younger patients. It means 2 things. One is that we should separate it out. And the other thing is that this deserves its own graph. So this lower graph, now all I've done is made a new control chart for this set of patients. And you can see that it tracks nicely. It does seem to run high a bit. And then those 3 months are worrisome. And there are 3 months where we saw a lower pregnancy rate. We weren't able to define what occurred then, but it at least gave us an indication that something was going on and that it would be something worth looking into. All right, so in conclusion, and I'd say, in answer to the question posed at the start of this talk, are KPIs doing enough for us? I'd say not completely, and we need to continue to refine and apply KPIs. So for benchmarking, both against best practice and within the lab to identify best practices there, tracking quality to identify unexpected shifts or an impact of an introduced change. And lastly, what we'll be seeing next is to do automated electronic dashboards that facilitate KPI use. All right, and thank you for that. I'll stop sharing.
Great. Thank you, Dean. Thank you, everybody. There'll be time for questions at the end of the webinar. Can I ask, I noticed there were a few questions coming up in the chat. Just to make sure that we actually get to see the questions, could you please make sure that you ask them in the Q&A section and not the chat? So that's the button next to the chat at the bottom of your screen. That would be great. Thank you. So now it's time to move to our panel presentation. Are our lab systems working the way we expect? And we're going to have presentations by Alison Campbell, Aidita James, and Katie Heywood.
Great. So the aim of this panel presentation is to explore the concept of data visualization within the lab, how we can take the KPIs off the page and put them to work for us. The first presentation is by Alison Campbell, who's Group Director of Embryology at Care Fertility, with responsibility for 12 embryology labs. Her presentation will be followed by Katie Heywood, and she's a clinical embryologist at Cambridge IVF in the UK, and she'll be showing us how they have applied Tableau to monitor KPIs. And Dr. Aidita James is the laboratory director of the IVF lab at the Art Institute of Washington, and she will be talking about applying DIRO, D-I-R-O, in the embryology laboratory. Okay, great. Thanks, Alison.
Oh, thank you. Good evening. I hope you can see my slide. Always a pleasure to be here at i3, so thanks very much to Sharon, Dean, and the i3 team. So I wanted to spend a few minutes talking through some of the different ways, and particularly one example that we've been experiencing recently at Care Fertility, to look at KPIs in a more visual way. We're all faced with so much data, very unstructured at times, and we need to find ways that we can quickly and easily look at KPIs. And it's always been a challenge, and you can see from this slide, we've got data coming in from all different areas. And we can build KPIs around them, but many of us don't have the time or the skills sometimes to do this effectively. So today we're talking about some of the lab-specific KPIs, and I'm just going to use one example of a visual tool that we are starting to look at in our clinics. So I don't profess to be an expert, it's early days for us, but I'm certainly a fan. So we've been looking briefly over the consensus documents that Alpha amazingly prepared over the years. And KPIs are really important for systematic monitoring of the laboratory, at least in my opinion, and a very important element of the quality management system. There are so many of them, it's very difficult to go through them all in great detail. So I'm just going to give a brief example. And this one here, we use Power BI, it's a Microsoft tool, which allows us to generate and embed interactive reports. So we saw Excel from Dean's slide, how you can filter very easily. We're probably all quite familiar with that. But this more sophisticated tool can allow us to slide a bar to change the date periods, to have a drop down of all the different clinics, particularly useful for people like me who work within a group of clinics. So this is just an example, and it's not real data, but it's just to show how we can visualize and compare clinic practitioners. So in this one, we're looking at what we call broad shoulders data. We're looking at different medical staff that perform the egg collection or the embryo transfer. So we can compare them against each other within one clinic, against the average for the clinic, or against some of our other clinics. We can compare two clinics, two practitioners, all small clinics against the large clinics. So multiple ways of looking at this very important data. And then we can drill down into much more detail and look at individual practitioners in different date periods, different clinics, different egg collection needles, just so many different ways to do this. And Power BI allows us to drill down into very fine detail. So it gives us both the big picture and the smaller details. So if we identify that one of our KPIs is drifting off, then we can go much deeper into the data in a very visual way. which for many people is a much more effective way of looking at complex data. So that's just an overview of one of the ways that we can do this, and I'm looking forward to a very interesting panel discussion about different methods as well. Thank you.
Oops. Great, thank you, Alison. So since this is a panel presentation, we're going to move straight on to our next presentations. And those presentations were recorded by Katie Heywood and Dr. Aidita James. And then after that, we will have a panel discussion about electronic dashboards. Take it away.
Hello, and thank you for asking me to talk today. I'm going to talk about Cambridge IVF and how we are currently monitoring our KPIs. This all started really in lockdown. I was working at home and my husband works with data for a job. So the question was, can we do something to make our KPI analysis a little bit easier? So we record everything into an Excel spreadsheet, and trawling through those, looking at numbers has never been very easy. So he's designed us some dashboards to use, the first of which I'm going to look at is the Vienna consensus. So you'll see here a series of 15 different graphs. So we're monitoring here things from the Vienna consensus, some of the performance indicators, some of the KPIs, and also some of our own. So we like to look at overall utilization rates, for example, of embryos. So if we look at this one to start with, this is our egg recovery rate. So number of eggs collected from X number of follicles. This headline figure here is the overall for the time period. And you can see here that this is the line graph showing the trends over time. If you hover over it, it tells you exactly what it is. So during Q4 of 2015, this is our egg collection rate. So it's very easy to see how we're trending, if there's dips, if we're hovering along at a comfortable rate. This grey area here is actually the cutoff, the Vienna consensus competency level. So you can see here it's set at 80%. So as long as we are in this grey bar, we know we are doing okay. This gap here is actually COVID. So obviously we stopped all clinical work. So there's a gap there in the data. The next one really, I can run through them if we look at injection rates. So again, this is a measure of egg maturity. So looking at number of metaphase 2s at the time of denudation. We've got our IVF specific KPIs. We've got our 2PN rates, 1PN rates, 3PNs, polyspermy rates. And then we've got our ICSI specific KPIs as well. So again, we're looking at our 2PN rates, 1PN rates, damage rates. And again, this is useful. We can actually see by operator as well. So how the operators are performing in each quarter. The date range is completely selectable. So on this sliding bar here, we can actually change that if we want to look at a smaller time period, if we want to look at a more up-to-date time period. We can select the data into months, quarters, and years. And if we want to look at something, if we wanted to look at just our IVF implantation rates, say, we can do that, a few buttons. So here we've got our implantation rates. These two lines, one is cleavage, so day 3 implantation rates, and this one up here is looking at our blastocyst day 5 implantation rates. If we want to separate that out and look with the benchmarking values, competency levels, we can see here we are a little bit below where we want to be. So I'm just going to put this back to all treatments. And show you another feature of this dashboard. We can look, another one we like to look at, again, it's not part of the Vienna consensus per se, it's looking at our, and here it's termed biochemical loss rates, but actually it pertains to all early pregnancy losses. So we could say what's happening with this spike here. If we click on that point, that will also show us all the relevant points are highlighted on the other on the other graph. So are we seeing anything particular that's happening in any of the other things? Have we got a low recovery rate? Have we got low maturity rates? What's going on with TPN rates at that same time? We can also, if we want to delve a little bit deeper, click across to our focus dashboard, we call it. So again, this is a series of bars over time, again, completely selectable date range. I'll just explain a little bit here. Obviously, sample size is important when looking at data. So anything in pink, we've got more than 25 cycles. This quarter here, less than 25 cycles. So although it's standing out as terribly high, it's because there were only 5 cycles in that period, coming back after lockdown, really. If we want to look more in depth, we could say look at 2021 quarter 3, where our highest loss rates, frozen cycles, ICSI cycles, IVF cycles. So again, all of these are selectable if we wanted to look at what's happening in our older patients. Again, we can look at this. And as soon as these bars go blue, we know we're looking at small sample numbers. So the cycle numbers are along the bottom, and all of this is selectable. So I'm going to look at something more interesting. If we were to look at pregnancies per embryo transfer, click off that one. So again, you can see this horizontal bar is the overall rate for the selected period. So again, this is showing us where our average is across that time period. If we want to look in depth at smaller age brackets, we can break that down into 2 years. So we can look to say, here are our pregnancies in 2-year age brackets. So what's happening as we go through the years, our older patients less likely to get pregnant, and it really starts to drop off above 40. Right, I'm now going to take you to our next dashboard, which is clinical statistics. So this gives us a much broader overview of clinic performance. We can look here at how we're doing in terms of cycle numbers, overall transfers. We can look by operators. And this really gives us an idea of how the variables are correlating. I know the text is going to be small, but the idea here is that it is really easy to start clicking around how are we doing and how the variables correlate. We've got a similar one for our IUI data, but I won't show you that at the moment. And the last one I want to look at is treatment selection. So again, this is a historical look at live birth outcomes, singles, twins, triplets, and based upon your age, whether you're having fresh or frozen, the day of the transfer, is it a day 3, day 5, and the number put back, what are your chances of single live birth, twins, and triplets? Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so very much for your kind invitation. It's my pleasure to briefly share our lab's approach to assessing clinical data that we track in our laboratory in Washington, D.C. Since about 2019, we've used an app called DIRO. It's available from IVF QC, which stands for Data In and Reports Out. I also have no commercial disclosures. The DIRO system is possibly a bit complicated, but it's kept fairly simple for users once it is set up. This diagram here shows how the data is all kept secure on a HIPAA certified servers and encrypted. And if you don't want to use the HIPAA certified servers, you can also apparently opt for a local server solution, but we did not use that particular option. Before you set up DIRO, you must train it. The system does not automatically tell you what your endpoints are or the functions you're interested in. Basically, it's not telepathic. It does not know what KPIs you like to study or track. You must set it up first and connect the app with your EMR data or any other databases. Defining each function and KPI the first time is a little bit of work, but the support team can help you out. Once it's done, you don't have to make any more changes unless you would like to. There's apparently no limit to how many data sources you could connect to the system. You can use it for research or business needs. Basically, this means that you can combine clinic, lab, admin, and research data. It's completely customizable. So in this slide, I'm going to quickly show you some examples of our reporting. We prefer tables and traffic light color coding to look for acceptable trends. So the green, yellow, and red. Green good, yellow for normal, red for, well, not our favorite. Here are partial staff outcome reports that analyzes the distribution of certain patient groups by age or prior attempts, for instance. It allows us to set really narrow windows for staff differences, and everyone in our group has access, and we have meetings about these reports. There are different groups of KPIs depending on the outcome you study. In the lab, we are, of course, very much interested in staff differences, disposables, instrument performance. This one in particular, ICSI outcomes such as damage rates or embryo development are tracked. Damage rates are the second column from the right. And we want to make sure that everybody within the group has similar outcomes. We also try to subdivide the groups by patient prognosis, because that can have a role in gamete quality. You can also use Diro to sort frequencies and outcomes of oocyte and embryo cryo. You can set your own periodic intervals. We prefer weekly and monthly reports, but this is of course dependent on how many labs you track and how many cases you do. Reports can be saved, of course, and sorted and shared. Again, these files and folders here represent our preferences, but this will differ for each lab. We track currently about 115 functions in our lab. Here you see a snapshot of our list. Again, this is completely customizable. And in conclusion, this system is totally manageable once it is customized for the clinic and the laboratory. It is helpful to assess embryologists and other factors. You can extend performance of endocrinology, genetics, or andrology laboratories. You can also use this for comparing follicular monitoring, follicular assessment, whatever. It's totally, completely customizable. We like the tables with the stoplight system. You can have graphs, charts. It's pretty awesome, basically. And some of the slides that you saw before, they were just examples of what we see on our big screen. They weren't necessary for you to read them. So, yeah. Thanks.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you all. That has certainly shown us the range of applications of e-dashboards in the IVF lab. I'm sure there's more. Standing in for Aidita James, Jacques Cohen, who needs no introduction, will join us to discuss that application, Diro. And to start the discussion, I'd like to ask the group here, as we see them populate, come on screen. Could you each share with us how the use of this technology has affected the overall workload in the lab?
Shall I go first?
Sure.
Yeah. Well, it's quite early days, I would say, with the visualization tool that we've started working with, but I can envisage that it's going to save time, most importantly, and it should be able to help us respond more quickly if we start to see any downturn in any of the KPIs. So I think we'll be able to look more broadly at more KPI very easily, save time, and hopefully react faster.
Yeah. Yeah, Katie.
Yeah, we use it, and again, it's probably similar to Alison. We're just introducing it, so it's a bit of a pilot scheme. but we're finding it a massive time saver. No more hours trudging through spreadsheets. The refreshes we can do as often as you like. We tend to do them once a month, just refresh the data, get the up-to-date stats. And then we use that for the management team just to look at overall pregnancy rates. We look at our KPIs quarterly, and we also get up-to-date patient information on a quarterly basis as well. So across the board, it's saving a lot of time. It's so simple, and it's just data and information at your fingertips. So really made us a lot more efficient.
I have very little to add to that. I think the three systems look very similar, which is wonderful. Ours only started in 2019, so it's still early days since we had closures of obviously last year. And but we find that it is time that it saves time, obviously, but you spend a lot of time in the upfront setting it up. You need to, all of these systems, you need to make it proprietary for your circumstances and your IVF lab and your interests. And of course, later when you make changes, that again will take some time. In between, in the case of what Aidita uses, she has an API that connects to the EMR, and so it's automatically uploaded. So it's always there. So I think the advantage really is that you can look anytime and that you can look at any period. And so the instantaneousness is very different from what it was before. Yeah, and obviously you don't have to work anymore with Excel and do one report at a time, all by hand. All of that is gone. So I think this is the way forward with these systems. I think that is the way forward, but maybe we should have another session in 2 years and we can talk more about incidences and occasions where it really was helpful and how we changed going back. I think one question that comes up, Dean, that you probably can answer better than anybody is, do we really need every KPI? You know, does it really need to be all of what's being published? And extending to that, which is like what Aidita showed and you showed, others that have not been published. Do we really need all that? And time will tell, right? If you don't track it, you don't know.
Right. So one of the common themes, though, for all of these is obviously you have an electronic medical record or electronic health record that is where you can draw things on. That's probably the first step for many places if they don't have that in a rate limiting step. But the other part is about how much data is being put in. And I'm curious for the three of you, are you entering daily, are you checking more than just on day 5 blastocyst data? Are you doing cleavage stage data in there as well in the EMR?
Well, it's all of the above. So yeah, in our case, yes. But again, time will tell whether we are overdoing it. It's a smallish clinic. I'll wait for you and Alison in due course, people who run, you're experts in running multiple labs, getting a lot of data. Our clinic does only 700 transfers a year. So, we really have to look at what others are finding, but I think there will be important clinic differences, but I think there will be general trends that will come up out of these studies. Yeah.
Katie, you said, go ahead.
I also think that a lot of the data just remains in spreadsheets and it's hidden and it's never there to look at. As soon as you start getting people interested in it, looking at what's going on, potential problems, early warning systems, it actually then generates more questions, which you can then start to look at. So it's like a bit of a snowball effect. So I think it's a good tool as well for getting staff within the clinic interested in what's going on across the board.
Yeah, I think there's a risk, as we're suggesting, of having almost too much data and not knowing where to look. We certainly collect a lot of data, and in the labs, it's live data entry. So absolutely everything we do and everything we see, it's entered from the consumable, the piece of equipment, the time, the date, the person, the observation, everything. So it's exciting because once we pull all that together, we can really dive into the data. But I think there is a risk of obsessing over it and actually wasting time. And especially when it's so interactive and these reports are instantaneous, you could be tempted to every day run a new report.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's about just managing things carefully and effectively.
So it's like we have to be careful not to fall down the rabbit hole like we do on Twitter, maybe. Trying to keep control of the data. I thank you all so much. I think in the interest of time, we're going to have to move on, but obviously there'll be time at the end for some more questions and answers.
Yeah, great. Okay, so now to our final speaker of this session, Dr. Denny Sakkas. Many of you know Denny. He gives many excellent talks. He is the Chief Scientific Officer at Boston IVF and an adjunct associate professor at the Yale University School of Medicine. He's going to speak to us today about another application for KPIs, and that is to highlight the risks or errors associated with the laboratory. Thanks, Denny.
So thank you for the opportunity to talk at the Alpha symposium today, and thank you to i3 for their continued support for doing these conferences. Today I'm going to talk about highlighting risks or errors in the lab. My name is Denny Sakkas, and I'm Scientific Director at Boston IVF in Massachusetts, USA. So hopefully by the end of this talk, at the conclusion, you'll be able to, 1, identify areas in the lab and clinic where errors are more likely to occur. Secondly, establish effective quality systems for minimizing errors. Establish procedures for corrective action after errors are made. And most importantly, realize that non-conformances are a key KPI that are just as important as us tracking our pregnancy rates. So most of the data I'm going to show is already published. It was published in a paper several years ago called Types and Frequencies of Non-Conformances in an IVF Lab. And that was with my co-authors, Brent Barrett and Michael Alper. So what are errors and non-conformances? And what we were trying to look at is how many errors are likely to occur and are they reported? So this all stems from a number of concerning studies and from the medical health industry, if you want. And this is probably the main publication that sort of triggered a lot of interest in health systems and errors in health systems, called To Err is Human and Building a Safer Health System. This report made 2 important sort of conclusions, let's say, or brought up two matters that were very important. One, it described a serious concern in healthcare that if errors are discussed at all, they're only discussed behind closed doors, which is an important thing. And the title of the report encapsulates its purpose. Human beings in all lines of work make errors, and it's something we have to accept. This is probably the most concerning study that's come out in relation to errors. And it actually reported that based on the estimate of medical errors, that medical errors are actually the 3rd highest cause of death in the US once someone is hospitalized. So it's really concerning. And I don't know if it's like that. But of course, in IVF, we're not really looking at death, but we're looking at certain events that actually can cause complete psychological distress to families if a major error occurs. And the first thing I'd like you to understand is that don't go around thinking my lab never makes mistakes. It will, or it has. And that's the first point of not hiding them. So aren't laboratory errors, we have to think of what errors are made and how often they are. How many errors are too many? How do we minimize errors? And learn from the errors and take action. And errors can be documentation errors of a non-conformance, and that can lead to actually terminating an employee if systematic errors are found in employees. This is how we actually report errors. So we from the lab actually have an employee report of a non-conformance. It's a standard page, the type of non-conformance, the department, which was the lab, the date, and the description of the non-conformance. And I'll show some descriptions a bit later on. Once you have the report, you actually have to do something, and you have to record an immediate response. And this is done by the supervisor or the managers. So you have to report, every incident has to come with an immediate response, and also has to come with a correction, some sort of correction or action according to why that error may have occurred. So there are 3 phases in reporting a non-conformance or error. So these are the grades of the types of errors. that we actually looked at. So first we had the non-conformance grade of none or minimal, and this is normally a problem which does not measurably decrease the likelihood of a success of an IVF cycle, although it could result in the postponement of a cycle. The second one is a moderate error, and that's a problem that negatively affects a cycle, but not to the extent that the cycle is lost or severely compromised. It could include the loss of some gametes or embryos, or deviation from a protocol significant enough to reduce the chances of success in this cycle or future cycles, such as thaws. And then we have the two more significant ones. So significant one, compromises or loss of a cycle or future thaw cycle due to loss or mishandling of a majority of the gametes or embryos, or an isolated but significant deviation from a protocol affecting multiple patients. And that's non-conformances involving FDA regulations. And then finally, we have the major problems, systematic problems which significantly affect multiple patients over a period of time, including repeated or systemic documentation or record keeping, such as especially with frozen embryo identification, FDA violations, or other regulatory violations. And of course, a confirmed pregnancy involving misidentification of sperm, egg, or embryo. So what we did, we went back into our database of these non-conformance errors, and we actually looked from 2003 to 2015. It's probably about time I did an update of this paper too. And it was actually in andrology and embryology that we looked at the non-conformances. And what we did was, during the study period, we had a total of over 36 IVF treatment cycles, but you can't just look at a cycle in isolation, because every cycle involves numerous procedures. And I think the audience hopefully understands how many procedures are involved. And this is just looking, if you look at it, we actually calculated over 180,000 procedures by just taking some of the major procedures. But as you all know, there are multiple steps in every IVF cycle. So we know that there are multiple steps, and so each cycle contains some of these multiple procedures, but actually it's probably a minimalistic look at actually how many were actually occurred during each cycle. And these are examples of andrology, embryology non-conformances reported by staff. Obviously, they've been redacted from names and that. And also the relative severity. And actually what's important is the area that they occurred. So here's a human error. We logged it as none or minimal. And it was the patient, or the paperwork for patient XX had stated 21 eggs were retrieved, and there were actually 19 eggs in the dish. This is the second one's a moderate error in cryopreservation. While freezing 4 patients, I paused the instrument for seeding, and people will realize this is a slow protocol, so it was an old error. After seeding, I left the laboratory. I returned after 15 minutes and observed that the instrument was still in the pause mode and the temperature was at -7. And then finally, one of the significant errors, which we logged as an equipment error, while stripping cumulus cells of eggs for ICSI, all 5 eggs were destroyed by a foreign object in the tip of the stripper. So all these were acted upon and all these were documented, and we knew each area that they all occurred in. So, you know, what we were actually looking at, how many non-conformances and errors do actually occur in an embryology lab? We really had no idea, and the data actually didn't exist. So here is the number of none and minimal errors, moderate, significant, and luckily for us, there were no major errors, but there were 17 significant errors. And if you look at it per cycle, you're looking at about under 1% per cycle for each of these. And for the significant, you're looking at 0.05% per cycle and 0.18% for moderate errors. But then if you actually look at it per treatment site, per procedure, it's actually much less if you're looking at it for each individual procedure. But what maybe each clinic can relate to is how many errors you expect per treatment cycle. So a documentation or a minimal error would occur every 132 cycles. A moderate error was about 555, and significant error was about just over 2,000. So for a large clinic like ours, which is running over 6,000 cycles a year, we expect probably 2 to 3 significant errors a year. So, and that you know depends on your clinic. So this is the breakdown of where they occurred and where the origin occurred. And it's not surprising that minimal or documentation errors were major in the minimal errors. But what's interesting is you can see that in terms of moderate and significant errors, obviously a human component is responsible for those, but also there were certain equipment and supplies that we had to keep an eye on to look at moderate or significant errors. And then what's interesting, you can look at which areas these occurred in. So one thing obviously is the embryology area, but one thing that's really interesting was at this time was cryostorage. And some of these were historical, and we've actually seen that actually changing to vitrification, many of these were responsible because of slow freezing. We can see we actually changed protocols and moved to vitrification, and this number actually has gone down. On the contrary, this data sort of encompassed the beginning of an upbeat in PGT cycles, and you can see already that there was we needed to rectify some of the procedures more strongly in our PGT cycles, the way we handled those cycles, just to avoid any errors in that particular position of the embryology lab. So the errors will really help, or tracking errors will really help to see if there's any problem areas in the lab. So how do we compare against other areas of medicine? And there's really hardly anything around. We have isolated some papers here. If you look on the far left, these are clinical lab errors. These are from endocrine labs or just handling diagnostic labs. And you can see the error rate is about 0.45% per procedure. An interesting analogy is transfusion errors, which is not as complicated as IVF, but fairly complicated. You can see it's about 0.3%. And here you have the Boston IVF endocrinology. It's a pretty, this is mostly diagnostic, very no actual moderate or significant errors. And then you can see our data looking at both moderate and significant errors combined are about 0.2, 0.3%. And then there were some papers that actually from other mismatch rates from automated, looking at automation of the lab using witnessing systems. You can see overall the error rates in IVF labs that we could find are actually quite low. So we actually looked around and we saw that there are reports of adverse events. And this is one of the interesting ones. I don't know if there's a newer report, but this is from the HFEA, showing a similar grade, actually, which was interesting. I was contacted after I gave this talk at ESHRA once by the HFEA about our grading protocol, about our 4 grades. And it's interesting that there are some similarities between our grades and that, so and the HFEA's. But you can see actually the error rates in terms of how many errors have occurred are quite low. But you can look at the number of incidents by category. Actually, in the HFEA report, you can see where they occurred. Communication errors are high, administration, obviously these are more documentation errors, laboratory processes. So that you are starting to get an idea of tracking where these errors occur. We actually tried to calculate, according to the number of cycles, how many errors occurred overall in the actual number of incidents reported, to see if there were any changes in the trends. And you can see here that the trends are actually quite low. These incidents, they're not as documented just as we had, but you can see that the error rates were quite low. And then you can see if we compare the HFEA error rates per cycle, so we actually went in and calculated the number of incidents that they had tracked. So type B, for example, HFEA significant was about 0.3%, according to the number of cycles that were reported by the HFEA. You can see the moderate and significant compared were about 0.6%, but all these are actually well below 1%. So it appears that IVF is actually done quite safely in relation to many other areas. And you can see here in our own results, comparing to the HFEA laboratory, you can see the laboratory reported errors, because in some of the HFEA reports, they're quite different. They contain some clinical data. There is, these are the more specific laboratory areas that we analysed in green. You can see that the rates were actually very similar to what we had reported. So overall, it looks like IVF is fairly safe, if you want. One of the other reports which is interesting is actually the French agency reports incident rates again, and again, this is the number of reports and the number of clinics reporting. So this is up to 2015. This again actually has been updated, and there is a 2020 report if you're interested in going in and looking at this data. And it's quite it's a very well prepared report, but it is in French. They also break it down to where the errors and the number of incidents, and obviously you have stimulation, so you do also have clinical results here. But you can see egg collection, egg preparation, freezing, storage. All these areas are reported also, which is great to have and to follow that information. And it is broken down into serious and less serious incidents. Again, you can break it down into what fractions of incidents occurred. So it gives you more information of what areas are more likely affected by errors. And this is an update of the 2020 report. And one thing that's interesting here, and it's always hard to say because these are all voluntary, I think, reports, you can see one of the things that has always been postulated is that if you report errors and you're honest about errors, then your error rates decrease because you're working on those errors, you're actually treating them. So it's a very serious and very obvious needed KPI for a laboratory, any laboratory. Again, these are the areas of problems that were reported. So culture, egg collection, some of the clinic utilizations. Freezing is always an interesting one. So again, tracking the areas of error is very important when doing this type of analysis. So finally, this is just again the areas of attribution from the French reports. And then finally, how do you minimize errors in IVF? Well, there are two things you need to concentrate on. One is people, and one is the systems you have in place. And just briefly, in terms of people, there are publications highlighting what the optimal number of embryologists you should have in the lab. It's one of the key areas, and it's something that you really can't ignore. And the whole clinic has to actually invest in people and having enough people to actually run cycles. And as IVF cycles get more and more complex, PGT, dysregulated cycles, actually doing doing more frozen embryo transfers, so the cycles being actually disjointed, it's very important to have enough people in the lab. And not just embryologists, it's important to have enough staff, the physicians and registered nurses. So the whole clinic, it's important to have enough staffing and not to try to run on a shoestring. Finally, the systems that you have in place, and we know witnessing is the sort of the backbone of trying to avoid errors. Witnesses for every step, all the procedures, as I showed before, steps like wristband checks for egg retrievals and transfers, timeouts prior to egg retrievals and transfers. At the time of transfer, have TV monitors display patients' names and dates of birth, have labels and everything labeled, make sure that everything is actually confirmed by not just the embryologist, but by the patient, by the nurses and the physician. So these are all important steps in terms of improving your systems. If you want to see an interesting paper on looking at witnessing, I would recommend this publication. It's quite a few years old now, but looking at failure mode analysis of witnessing protocols. And this paper showed that when you actually did the analysis and acted on that analysis, you would improve your results. So this type of analysis is key to any clinic, small or large. So finally, you just really have to acknowledge that sometimes mistakes will happen and not try to put your head in the sand and say, my lab never makes mistakes. And in terms of quality management and KPIs, you have to report the non-conformances, you have to document them, respond to them, remedy them, and you will actually reduce the non-conformances because you understand where they are likely to occur and what are the hotspots for non-conformances. So it's imperative that you have this type of quality management cycle introduced into your clinics. Finally, it's really interesting that many papers now or different countries now, I showed you the HFEA data, the French data, the Italians also have now a Notify library, And so it's great that people are starting to log these incidents, and hopefully we will at some stage have a global reporting mechanism for incidents and non-conformances in IVF. So my final thoughts are to understand errors will happen. You can't ignore that, but use them to improve. You should acknowledge them, understand why they happen, get to the source of the problem, create solutions by working with your employees and improving your processes. We've actually had embryologists actually improve processes because we realized there were weaknesses in our protocols. And finally, tracking non-conformances may be one of your most important KPIs. You have to understand that. So finally, I'd like to thank my co-authors in the paper, Brent Barrett and Michael Alper, who's also a pilot and understands the significance of these types of non-conformances, the embryologists and all the nurses and clinicians. And if you have any further interest in this, we did publish a paper several years ago about analysing the IVF lab error rates and talking about highlighting them or hiding them. So thank you for listening, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Denny. I can see you're here, but I can't see you.
Yes, if we could everyone join in now for our question and answer session.
There you are.
Yeah, there's Denny.
There's
Nice
Denny.
to see you.
Denny, can I just ask a quick question before we open the floor? You talked about how if people are checking non-conformances, so you've got everyone in the lab actually looking, and that actually reduces the incidence because now people are paying attention. Do you see a difference when people join your lab from somewhere else? Like, is there a whole culture shift that they have to take to be able to do that? Or is that something that's already ingrained in IVF?
That's an interesting question, actually. I believe the first thing people have to realize is there's no punishment for reporting something, and you have to establish honesty. I couldn't tell you if someone, is hiding something, we wouldn't know that. I think in general, people realize that it's better to be honest, especially in a large lab. It's hard to hide something. It's much easier, in a lab where there's one or two people, I think, and that's probably the more dangerous scenario. And I think probably some of the larger errors that you hear in the press and that I might be guessing, but my guess is I think they've occurred in sort of smaller labs. But it's definitely much harder to hide something, in a larger lab where one day you're doing fertilizations and you write down there's 20 eggs, but there's only 15. The next day someone's going to see that. But if you're in a smaller lab, you're the one checking the next day or the following day and the following day. So that's where these errors I could envisage they'd creep in a bit more in a smaller lab. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your questions, but I would presume that most embryologists should learn that honesty is the best policy.
That's part of science training anyway, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, so here we are at questions and answers. Dean, I have a question for you from Hassan Berjak from Qatar. Hassan's also a member of the Alpha Executive Committee, and he's asking about the best KPIs for the andrology lab.
That's a great question, and a difficult one to answer because we don't have as good of measures for outcomes. I mentioned recovery rate, sperm recovery rate, which is actually a performance indicator. I'll clarify that statement. It is in the consensus, but I do think it needs to be, again, refined because of the differences in the way we can isolate sperm. There are others such as survival for cryopreservation. So that would be a useful one. But I, to be honest, don't have much to offer on that. And so I'll open it up to the others. If anyone has anything else they're using they find useful in andrology.
I think fertilization rates, sorry, Denny, you can extrapolate if you've got high quality preparation procedures in your andrology lab, then you would see that in your fertilization rate for IVF and ICSI. But yeah, it's not straightforward, is it? There are, it's much more ambiguity around andrology KPIs, unfortunately.
I was actually going to mention exactly the same, fertilization, and I can give an example, which one of the Mortimers actually, really talks about quite often, and that is actually not washing the sperm properly. So, if there's even a bit of semen left in there, and trace in effect, that can actually help, hinder your insemination. So we've had, we are a clinic that sort of do 50% conventional insemination, 50% ICSI, but we have seen sometimes when maybe juniors are doing the sperm preps that they're not as diligent, or they're a bit like, they're worried that they're leaving too much pellet, or, and that's what we find. So in leaving too much pellet, you have a higher chance of leaving some semen or, remnants in there. And we have seen, actually, when we track KPIs of individual embryologists, that sometimes the juniors the sperm preps may actually be compromised. So, these are the types of things that I think Alison's completely right. Fertilization is probably one of your best indicators for a KPI for semen analysis, especially if you're comparing conventional insemination versus ICSI. You might not see an effect with ICSI, but you would see it with conventional.
So Denny, if I could follow up on that. So I've seen the same with getting a higher 1PN rate because of getting too many sperm. I'm curious, were you able to track individual technicians that you see a reduced fertilization rate or an increased failed FERT rate? What did you identify?
I think we saw a lower FERT rates in those, but actually it's interesting to look at 3PNs and 1PNs we track, but actually it's an interesting probably index that maybe we could track a bit better. Yeah,
actually I meant 3PNs. I'm gonna have to apologize. Yeah. My time zone and hemisphere shift is not yet catching up, and so I also will address right now that in addition to missing the performance indicator, I'm going to, regarding the blastocyst rate for including cleavage stage, that was a mistake as well, that it would actually be lower if you're including cleavage stage embryos, unless you include the transferred embryo. So just to clarify that was asked by Amy Sparks, and she's correct. We should see a lower blast use rate. I was looking at embryo use rate though. But great comments though on the FERT rate discussion, because it is an area that for those that are still doing a lot of IVF, which we know is something that's desirable for many clinics in many areas, knowing how to fine tune that is important.
There was a study I did a long time ago, 24 years ago, I think. And I found that if there was some semen left in the sperm prep, it affected the percentage of hyperactivated sperm. So that's actually a way of, if you've got the capacitated sperm population you're about to inseminate, if you have a way of checking for hyperactivation, that can actually give you a little bit of information. And if they're not hyperactivating well and you wash them out into fresh medium, they, from my study, they regain the ability. So that might actually be quite a useful KPI with a potential measure and solution too. Okay.
I'm gonna
yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah, I'd like a general question for the panel from Bront Stone regarding data accumulation and crunching routines. This is his comment, so I'm going to read it. Data accumulation and crunching routines are empowered primarily when their summaries are critically discussed amongst all contributors. So when we look at a practice-wide discussion, that process will engage the process for embryologist clinician improvement and not allowed to be feared as a less constructive finger pointing process. So the question for everyone is, how often and how do you go about having these types of conferences with the whole clinic? What are you guys practicing?
Well, it's a very good question and a very good point. And it shouldn't be a question. It should be generally accepted that you provide this information out in the open. That certainly 20, 30, 40 years ago wasn't done. But that's changed over time. And so teamwork is essential, being very honest about this. And I think Katie said that, make these reports available for everyone. Everyone should have access. There sometimes are limitations depending on the program you use. There are quite a lot of products out there for business intelligence. And they could be charging per individual, and then that would be limiting. But if they're not, then you should provide access to everyone, so they can see this. They can see their own data. I think Art Compass does that too, right? They provide the app for anybody who signs on of a program, and they can follow their own data. So I think it's very important to provide the tools to make it visual for everybody, and also to discuss it. You know, whether that's weekly or monthly, I don't know, but I think it should be discussed.
We tend to look at it quarterly, and it's there to generate healthy discussion. If we can help each other improve, compare even minor differences between techniques, then we might see improvements. And especially when new practitioners are starting, we can look at competency levels. When new doctors join the clinic, we're looking at transfer rates and just monitoring quarterly.
Say, Katie, how large is the Cambridge clinic? I'm curious, on a quarterly basis, is that based on size? How many retrievals or transfers do you do?
Yeah, not a massive amount. I mean, we're heading up sort of trying to get about 500 cycles, 600 cycles a year at the moment. So we're still low in terms of cycle numbers. That's why we're so careful about the blue and the pink bars and looking at when we hit, 25 cycles. And we find that if you break the data down too much, it then becomes, you're looking at too few cycles to actually be meaningful.
So that definitely helps to know that when you say you're doing it quarterly. So like in New Zealand with 2,500 cycles, was doing it twice a month, just looking for trends, but it's definitely a numbers approach. Alison, how frequently are you guys looking at yours?
Monthly, generally. So even if it's a small clinic, our smallest clinic probably is about approaching 500 cycles, and our biggest probably approaching 1,500 cycles. But all of them would look monthly.
Yeah, Dean, we've got sort of an ongoing sort of analysis that we can run, but probably we will look at it monthly, but sort of discuss it between the embryology, meeting probably every 2 or 3 months. Transfers are sort of sent out to the doctors every year. That's always a contentious one. The thing, I don't know if you spoke about it earlier, but people see some of these data as, I'm concerned about it because we're looking for the worst person. But we've had quite a few examples where, for example, we've got someone with, much higher, continually ICSI rates. So we'll get that person and we'll get the whole lab to watch them and actually see, what little nuance are they doing differently. And that's happened, even with doctors that are doing transfers, that are actually outperforming continually. We'll have the doctors watch them. So, the KPIs, sometimes people fear them because they think you're looking for the negative, but actually they're just as informative for the positives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And actually that kind of brings up another one of the questions that was, I think, a doubter, shall we say, or where was the question here? Has this KPI technology really led to improved live birth rates? And I would argue for one that we just started doing KPI technology, but it was Peter Drucker who said you can't improve something if you don't measure it. And you just hit the nail on the head, Denny, is that if you're able to show who's doing the best and you can then learn from that, you're going to improve. We can't possibly improve if we're not measuring it, and we need good tools to do that.
Yeah, can I just add to that? I mean, it's certainly true, but we did start using KPIs earlier, but they were just not published. And maybe we looked at the wrong endpoint. I think Rusty Poole was asking today whether can you really argue that these KPIs that have been in consensus meetings, that these are specific for embryologists? I think that's one point. But Joe Cohen has, shown and talked about looking at ICSI endpoints and 2PNs, looking at improving ICSI over the years, emphasizing what you just said, Dean and Denny too. I mean, that you can actually improve ICSI by looking at the better performers. So that relationship, I think what he showed goes back 20 years.
Yeah.
And Christy
agree.
Devani has done the same. And so and that also is at least 20 years of data. So I think there are examples that are coming out now, but you have to look over a longer time where it's really clear that you can improve things with following KPIs.
Well, and I would just add on that, given that it's my pet area in particular, is we've definitely picked up things like problems with oil quality because of tracking, and then corrected by saying something's wrong, what changed, and then remove that from the system. That improves live birth rates right there. So this has many ways to improve it. We're going to reap the benefits of it with better technology.
Dean, there are a couple of questions that sort of follow on from the conversation that we've all been having. One was from Annabella Marcaneto from Argentina, and the other from Ariel Rodrigo Villaseñor Garcia. I hope I pronounced that. And both of them were asking, when you're in a lab that's not 500 cycles a year, when you're in a lab that's got 80, 100, 150 cycles a year, how can you use the KPIs, or this is for everyone really, how can you use the KPIs? How can you apply this technology to still be able to get some meaningful information?
Yeah, that's the biggest weakness in the system, is that we have to have numbers to really be able to accurately assess what's going on. I've benefited, and I'd say Alison might be able to say the same, is that when you have a number of clinics that are all using the same protocols and the same products, that you can look at a smaller clinic and say this is random variation because it is a smaller clinic, because everything else is doing fine with the same products and the same protocols. That's helpful when you're in a big system. But if you're just alone by yourself, the patient factor itself is so huge, and the doctor factor. And I know Rusty Poole asked a question, how many of our KPIs can we actually attribute just to what we do? And almost all of our KPIs are also tied to the stimulation, egg quality, and obviously the embryo transfer technique. So going back to earlier discussions, and maybe even the consensus from Cairo, that it's all important. There's so many things that it makes it virtually impossible to use the KPIs in a small system. Other than the thing that I keep coming up against is there's false positives over and over again. False positives in that we can't, not because because they are truly false positives, but often we'll see changes. We can't determine what the reason was for that deviation. And it may just be patient variation, but there's a lot of unknowns in our system.
Do you think taking rolling averages, like a Tukey window, would be a way of managing that? So if you work on a number of cycles that you agree is good, and I think, Katie, you said you wanted to get to more than 25? Yeah. So if you do a rolling window of 25 and kind of smooth it, do you think that would be an approach that clinics of that size would be able to still apply KPIs for?
I think rolling averages would be the best scenario for for a small clinic, and they pick whatever 25, 50. I think that would be the best, and then it's hard still to do, but you would develop a feel if you're dropping in 2 successive sort of quarters or whatever. That's and I think Dean sort of also mentioned that having a relationship with clinics that are maybe using similar media, similar processes or similar protocols. It doesn't have to be in the same network or group, but just if you know who's using similar media and things like that, it's always good if you have some concerns to phone them up and say, look, we're having this issue. Do you know if you're having the same lot number issue or something like that? So I think you sort of have to develop a slightly different strategy in sort of tracking these things if you are from a smaller center.
Great. All right. Well, I think that's drawing us to a close. I think we're past our time. Thank you all for joining us. We would like to thank you all who took part in this webinar. Dr. Sharon Mortimer, myself, Dr. Alison Campbell, Dr. Aidita James, Dr. Jacques Cohen, Ms. Katie Heywood, Dr. Denny Sakkas, and all of the audience members who sent in their questions. Thanks for the questions. And thanks to the organizing committee of the I3 initiative who produced these webinars, these great webinars that we've got going again. Jacques, Peter Naj, Giles Palmer, Thomas Elliott, Mira Sevetsev, and Shaista Sadruddin.
Great. Thank you again for joining us today. So the next I3 session is next week on the 28th of September, same time, same place. And it's going to be a webinar about technology in the lab for better efficiency. And it's entitled Driving Efficiencies in IVF Upwards. And the moderators are going to be Dr. Alejandro Chavez Badiola and David Sable. With the presenters will be Matt Pettit, Dr. Dimitri Kostin, Mrs. Unica Alexander, and Dr. David Sable. So we'll see you all then. In the meantime, thank you very much for being here today. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.